Thank you. It is truly an honor to be here at the State Archives, especially since they were responsible for giving so much of my material for this book. So as you're going to see tonight, I'll be giving a lot of thanks to the archives based upon some of the pictures and some of the documents and everything. So I can't say enough about this place. You all got to come here and do some research, because that's what it's all about. So I apologize up front. I've got some seasonal allergies, as most of you probably know that's going on. So we'll do our best to get through this. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about the blood feud on Bull Creek, the Meadows-Bilyeu Feud. Some people have asked me, is it Bilyeu or is it Blue? And it definitely is Blue if you ask the Blues. Do we have any Blue family in here? Do we? Okay, good. Do we have any?
Not that family.
Not that family. Okay, how about Meadows? Any Meadowses? No? Okay, then we're all safe. That's good. Because I kind of promised them we wouldn't have a feud in here tonight. So, yeah. So a little bit about me. She already kind of talked about most of it. Probably the last thing is that she didn't say is I should have paid more attention in English class, honestly. And I really consider myself more of a researcher than a writer. But I tried to do my best. I took a genealogy project, to be honest. It was a genealogy project and turned it into a book while COVID was going on. So that's kind of how this became what it became. So as talked about, it really did dominate the headlines from about 1898 to 1901. We're going to talk about things that led up to it and some things that even happened after the major, what I call the major battle, which happened in 1898. But the newspapers around the country, especially in Missouri, were hungry. They were news hungry for news out of the Ozarks. 1898. Okay, well that was a few years after another big event that happened down in the Ozarks, the Ball-Numbers, right? So that was a really big deal going on down there, dominated the headlines down around the country with the vigilantes, the Ball-Numbers. And then they had a little problem where they got hung. And so they had to phase out. And there was a little news gap there for a while. People were looking for something, and then this came along. And you can see, here's one from the Sunday St. Louis paper, big headlines there. And there's little articles I got from different places. And there was even articles from overseas that were talking about this. So it was very interesting to people at that time. So, what happened? Well, we'll kind of lead into some of the things that kind of led up to it. But where this really started was in February 1884. There was a man named Adam Fleetwood, and he got released from prison in Springfield, Missouri for actually horse thieving. Believe it or not, most people think if you stole a horse back in those days, you got hung. And strangely enough, there's very few cases of somebody being hung for horse thievery unless it was by vigilantes. But legally, it was not a hanging offense. So anyway, he went to prison for 2 years for that, and then he was making his way back home down to Douglas County, and he got caught up in a snowstorm. So he stops at the house of a man named Alexander, better known as A.A. Payton, and he lived on Saddlebrook. Has anybody heard of Saddlebrook? Okay, it's north of Branson, a few miles there. It's an incorporated area now. It's got really nice homes in it. And it's just off of Bull Creek, a little bit west of Bull Creek down there in the Ozarks. And that's where the Paytons lived at that time. So he got caught in this snowstorm, and Payton decides to stay on and help Fleetwood decides to stay on with the Paytons and help them get through the winter. But spring came on. A.A. Payton had to go to the Indian Territory to do some sales work. He was going to buy some horses, that kind of thing, do some business. And Fleetwood said, well, I tell you what, I'll ride with you at least part of the way, and then I'll go back home and take care of your family while you're gone. So they get to that point. A.A. goes on to the Indian Territory, and Fleetwood returns back to the farm, where he starts to try to swindle the family out of the farm. He tells them that A.A. has sold the farm to him, and he wants them to get out because it's his farm now. And he shows them some kind of weird paper that, made up thing he made up. Anyway, he goes up to Ozark. The sheriff wouldn't believe him, and And so he tries to sell it to the neighbors. The neighbors are all like, well, he would never sell a farm. But he finally finds a willing buyer. And this guy named Lemuel, kind of hard, Lemuel Tompkin, we just call him LT or Bud, but mainly he went by LT. And he goes ahead and he forces the PAYTONs out, and they go back down to Arkansas where they were from, at least for a while. All this time, AA doesn't know about this. All he knows is his letters are not being returned because they've been kicked out of the house and they're down in Arkansas. Fleetwood, he takes off. He heads down to Douglas County, almost never to be seen again. Later on, a few years later, there's an attack on him. Nobody knows who did it, but a shotgun blast outside his house wounds him a little bit. But AA comes home. Finally, he's getting worried, cuts his business deal short. He comes home and he gets into a lawsuit with Matthews, and Matthews loses, and he's mad, right? So he vows revenge on AA Payton. Says, he's pretty mad the fact that he got swindled and he lost the farm. And this is a picture of AA Payton. Kind of rough, but that's the best we could find of old AA. But that's AA Payton a few years later when he was living in Springfield, Missouri. So we go forward to March 18th of 1885. The Paytons it's late at night, it's cold, they've just gone to bed, they're in their cabin, and then all of a sudden, and this is real footage of the explosion. No, I'm just kidding. I think we've had enough of that. But anyway, their cabin explodes, right? And somebody had thrown a dynamite charge on the roof of the cabin right above where AA and his wife were sleeping, and it blew up the cabin. Let's see if we can pass it down. And of course, suspicion immediately goes to LT Matthews because he had vowed revenge. So, but there was no evidence against him, so he was not immediately arrested. However, Alexander Meadows, who was go down one more here. Alexander Meadows, who had an adjoining farm with the Paytons, he was a fairly well-to-do guy, okay? Alexander he was a farmer, but by Ozark hillbilly standards, he was pretty well-to-do. He had lands that went all the way from Christian County down into Taney County, all along Bull Creek there. So he was pretty well off, and he had the funds and the means to help his neighbor A. Payton out to try and find out who bombed his house. So he spent a lot of money. Of course, Matthews, who was also a neighbor, didn't like this, didn't like the fact that Meadows was helping him. The Matthews family started getting threats, including night riders. All right, so we got to remember what time of the year was this, or what time of the was this? 1885, right? Time of the ball numbers. So it never specifically says they were ball numbers. It just calls them night riders that came and visited the Matthews and gave them warnings that you need to get out of the county. So LT decides to move away temporarily to his father-in-law John Dye's house near Chadwick. So on April 12, 1885, LT and his family load up in a wagon, and he's got his wife with him and his sister-in-law Belle and his 2-year-old son Claudie are all in the wagon. Now the wagon was basically like this. Got this wagon here. LT was sitting here, Minnie was over here. This is Belle and this is 2-year-old Claudie. In between the seats, and the buckboard seats, these two here face backwards. These obviously face forward. And in between the seats, there was a bunch of household goods, and in between the seats, there was a headboard for a wooden headboard for a bed in there. Well, as they neared a bend in the road right here, 2 shots rang out. One of the shots hit LT in the arm. The other shot, unfortunately, went through the headboard, went through the head of Claudie, and it was lodged in one of the bows, which is, the bow is what the canvas you put on a covered wagon. So it was lodged in a bow, and it killed little Claudie, little 2-year-old Claudie. Oops, wrong button, sorry. So LT was wounded and Claudia was killed. LT sees two individuals that ran off, and he immediately identifies them as 15-year-old James and 17-year-old Riley PAYTON, the sons of A.A. PAYTON. He grew up with them, he knew them well, he watched them for about 200 yards, and he saw them turn around, saw them run away. So he knew who they were. So they were immediately arrested based upon the eyewitness testimony. James, they decided to split the trials, and 15-year-old James is tried first. He's found guilty and he's sentenced to hang. Of course, they appealed it immediately to go to the Supreme Court. And then Riley's tried, and he's acquitted. Okay, and this is based mainly on a discrepancy in the timeline of events and where Riley was at the time. And so he actually was acquitted. So the case of James is appealed. It goes, at least temporarily, goes to Supreme Court Judge Adiel Sherwood, and he temporarily stays the execution based on waiting to see what happens with the appeal. But the Missouri Supreme Court upholds the verdict and the sentence, and they set a new execution date. However, there was a lot of public opinion about hanging a 15-year-old boy. So, but the problem was at that time, back in those 1880s, the governor only had two options. He could only either let the boy off completely or let him hang. He could not commute a sentence. So that wasn't good. The public didn't want to let him off completely. So Governor Marmaduke, John Marmaduke, most of you have heard of him, right? Pretty famous governor, Civil War general. He gets the law changed that allowed for commutation. And on March 16th, 1887, just 2 days before James was to be executed, Governor Marmaduke actually commutes the sentence to life in prison. And thank you, Missouri State Archives, because there is the actual commutation of James's death sentence to life in prison. Very nice to have. Yeah. So, jump ahead, July 4th, 1887. By the way, James, he's in prison, Missouri State Penitentiary. But a few months later, July 4th, 1887, Alexander Meadows, remember him, the rich Meadows, my relative, by the way, and his wife, Allie, they're walking along a road down near Bull Creek and heading to his brother John Hanson Meadows' place. And as we said, Alexander contributed considerable money toward the PAYTON family, the PAYTON boys' defense and investigation into the bombing. And as we said, LT had vowed revenge, and Alexander himself had been indirectly threatened to leave the county, because he had supported this baby killer, right? So as they're walking along, a shot rings out from behind him, out of the bushes, and shoots Alexander in the back. Allie, his wife, immediately recognized the shooter as L.T. Matthews. He stood up, looked at her, and she even asked him not to shoot her. Said, "L.T., don't shoot me." And, he's already dead. And this is the site down there in Gravelly Hollow, along that, not too far from where, I'm not sure many of you have been down there, but the Meadows have a cemetery down there and a one-room schoolhouse that's been there for over 100 years. And it was very near where the Meadows Cemetery is now. And that's Allie Meadows, my great-great-great-grandmother. So LT is quickly arrested based upon the eyewitness testimony of Allie. An inquest was held where Madison Day was the coroner, James K. Polk McCaffey was the sheriff, and if any of you know your ball knobber history, those are two of the original 13 ball knobbers, Taney County ball knobbers. Okay? And then Stephen Blue, who we're going to talk about here in a little bit, he was the recorder during this trial. So Alexander's buried in Meadows Cemetery. That's his current headstone, where down there. He was a Civil War veteran as well. And L.T. Matthews goes to trial on October 14th through the 17th, 1887, before Judge W.D. Hubbard. James DeLong was the prosecutor, and Reuben Branson was the county clerk. Also, 2 of the original 13 ball numbers. Look a little suspicious here, like there might be some, is it collusion? Would that be the word, I think? Collusion. Anyway, possibly. So the trial was held in the Forsyth School, as just a couple of years before that, the courthouse had been burned. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of records there that would have been very helpful to a lot of people. But Matthews ended up being acquitted due to the testimony that had him several miles from the scene. He had a lot of friends down there in those times. There were ball numbers, there were anti-ball numbers, and there was a lot of conflict between them. But he ended up getting acquitted even with the eyewitness testimony of Allie. Unfortunately, back in those days, women weren't given a lot of, you didn't think a lot of their testimony. And thankfully, things have changed. And no one was ever to be convicted of the crime. So it's still a cold case if you want to get the money for it. So back to James Payton now. He's been now in prison for nearly 10 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. The Payton family had tried repeatedly to get a pardon for James. They had contacted each one of the governors, tried to get a pardon. But so finally James wrote then Governor William Stone asking him for a pardon if he named the second shooter in the Claudie Matthews murder. Well, that seems kind of weird. Everybody thought that his brother was, but he was acquitted, so maybe he's got something there, and they wanted to make a name for themselves, so the governor agreed to it, and James names John Sandberg, we'll call him Bud, because that's what everybody call him, Bud Meadows, as the second shooter. Now, Bud Meadows is Alexander's son. Okay, and why did he name him? Because the night before the shooting of little Claudie Matthews, James Payton had spent the night at the Meadows residence. And he said that when he spent the night there, that he and Bud Meadows had come up with a plan to go shoot Matthews. So, true to his word, on January 11th, 1895, Governor Stone pardons James Payton, and Bud Meadows is immediately arrested. But due to a lack of evidence, the grand jury refused to indict Bud. And a lot of people thought that this looks a little suspicious. He's just trying to get out of jail by naming somebody. And I think that's part of the reason. Not only 10 years later did they not have enough evidence, but most of the public opinion was against any kind of indictment. So James, he got out. He's pardoned now. He moved to St. Louis, and he ended up working for a leather company. He had a very tragic life. He got married, his wife died very young, they had a kid, the kid died very young, and he had a very rough life after that time. And this is Missouri Governor Stone, and again, thank you very much to the archives, because there's the actual pardon that he made for James. Very, very stoic looking guy, isn't he? All right, so this is what the main shootout is about when Bull Creek ran red. I call it that, and I made a chapter of that because I'm not the first one to write about this. In fact, one of them was my grandfather, Chris Meadows. Some of you may have heard of him. He was pretty kind of semi-famous in Missouri for a long time because he played Old Matt in the Shepherd of the Hills play down in Branson for 30-some years. He also ran boats along the Taney-Como Mail between Branson and Rockaway in the early years, and he owned the Sammy Lane boat line well before it was a pirate cruise, for those of you who remember the pirate cruise. But he was a hillbilly's hillbilly. So, and anyway, he wrote about a book called Bull Creek Ran Red, so one of the chapters of my book is dedicated to that, and so we're going to talk about what happened there. So Steve Bilyeu and Bud Meadows had adjoining farms at the mouth of Dry Hollow, just on the west side of Bull Creek, right on the Taney County, Christian County line, actually in Christian County. That's Bud Meadows there. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Steve Bilyeu alive. You'll see in a minute. So they had adjoining farms. They had a common fence, and they had an agreement with this common fence that each one would take care of different parts of this fence. And there's the type of fence. Most of you call it a split rail fence. It's also called a worm fence. I think back in that day they called it a worm fence. And one of them had an agreement to do the riders, and the other the poles. And anyway, Bud didn't feel like Steve was keeping up his part of the agreement for the maintenance on the fence. So on May 4th, 1898, Bud goes to see this attorney in Ozarks, and he wants to dissolve their partnership, and he wants to build his own fence. So there was a 6-month waiting period at that point. So he waited a 6-month waiting period, and then in mid-November 1898, there's the first encounter. And what happened there was Bud was by himself, thought he was by himself, but he went down to the fence line, and there was a group of the Blues there and some of their friends. And at that point, they kind of bullied Bud, called him names. A lot of them we can't talk about in here, but there was a lot of name calling. And at one point, Steve Blue's older son, Pete, pulled a shotgun and pointed it at Bud and asked him to look down the barrels and see if he could see the loads in the gun. So Bud was pretty lucky to get away with his life that day. He backed off, went back home because he was outmatched at that point. But on November 30th, 1898, Bud decides he wants to get this fence built. So he assembles a work party to help him tear down the old fence and build a new one that would produce what's called a devil's lane, which is when you have two adjoining farms and a fence on one side, a fence on the other. There's usually a place where you can run your wagon or whatever cattle between them. That's called the devil's lane, kind of a neutral territory. So that's what they were going to develop. So Bud gets together this group, and first one he gets is Jacob. And by the way, I just want to tell you, one of the hardest parts of this book was keeping track of who is who. There's a lot of people named that are called the same name or were named the same. A lot of Jimmys, a lot of Steves, things like that. And there's a lot of intermarrying, as you're going to see, which made it even more difficult because the Blues, much like the Hatfields and McCoys, the Blues and the Meadows were very much intermarried. So Jake Squire is going to be on the Meadows side, okay, and he's a Blue. That's him right there. He was the brother of Steve Blue. Then you got Frank Tabor. We'll call him the Weasel, and he's kind of an instigator, and but he was a real good friend of Bud Meadows. Then we got Hosey Blue. That's Hosey right there. And Hosey was Bud's father-in-law. Okay? So let me get this really complicated for you. So here in a second, we're going to talk about Bob, but Bud and Bob are married to two of Hosey's daughters. So, yeah, you can figure that one out. And then we got Will Blue, who's a son of Hosey. We got Jimmy Blue, also a son. Mark, which is the son of Hosey. And then Jimmy Llewellyn, who is a nephew of Steve Blue. Whew. Getting pretty complicated now, isn't it? You're taking notes, right? And then, of course, Bob. Bob is the younger brother of Bud and his closest confidant. And then we've got Austin McKinney. He was called a stranger for the longest time because nobody knew who he was, really, in a lot of the court documents, until finally they found him down in Texas County. But he was just a guy with his family that was traveling through and happened to stop by Bud Meadows' farm the day before and asked if he could spend the night and made camp there. And Bud was like, yeah, no problem. He goes, hey, you want to make some money tomorrow? It didn't turn out to be the right decision, but he said, yeah, sure. So Austin McKinney was also on the work party. So the Blues. On the Blue side, on the Blue side, you've got Steve, the father. You've got Pete, his older son, and Jimmy, his next youngest son. Those were the three Blues that will be involved in this. And at this point, they are, that morning, they are going to take a wagon over to his brother, Squire Jake's house, and deliver this wagon. When they get there, though, they find out that, Steve and Pete were armed. When they get there, they find out that his brother is working for Bud. And so at that point, they run back to the fence because they're going to protect their part of the fence and everything. And this is when he drives the wagon on the south side of the fence, on his side of the fence, and arguments start. Okay, back and forth between these working parties. Now there's two, the Meadows working party had broken in two. One part of them was on the south part of the fence, and then Bud, his brother, and Frank Tabor were on the north side. But the group on the south side started arguing about taking down the fence with the Bilieus. So the argument ensues. Austin McKinney, he's smart because he's a stranger. He says, I'm not going to be a part of this. And he walks away and he goes back up the hill to Bud's house. Jake Blue, being a justice of the peace, he's trying to calm everybody down. And for a while he does. He gets them calmed down. However, during that calm down, Jimmy, and again there's a couple of Jimmys, but the Jimmy that is Steve's son runs back to the Bilyeu house and to grab weapons. And he grabs a shotgun and he comes back with his mother, Steve's wife, Elizabeth, John Bilyeu, who is a legend in his own down in those Ozarks, and that is Steve's father. This time he's 90-some years old. And he arrives on the scene, and little Jimmy comes back with a shotgun. Also, Selina Meadows, who is Bud's wife, Ozzy's daughter. Charlotte Meadows, Ozzy's daughter, and Bob's wife. And Frances Tabor, who I haven't mentioned yet, that's Frank Tabor's wife, who happens also to be Steve Bilyeu's daughter. But she's estranged from the family at the time. So, yeah, we're talking a lot of people intermarried here. So what happened next? Well, things calmed down for a while, and the women walk back to the house. Bud goes up, he sees the group arguing down there, so he goes to the house first, and he retrieves his Winchester and Bob's shotgun. Then Bud goes down to the fence. He and Bob go down to the fence and they start arguing a little bit, and then they calm it down and they start walking away, walking back toward their house. Now, the interesting part of this is there was a total of about 20 people in and around the fence at this time, okay, including the ones I've already talked about, and the Bilyeu's youngest son, Joe, this preacher Klinkenbeard that had shown up on the side, and there was a passerby that was on the road that was nearby. So there's, at least 20 people that were in there, and none of their stories matched. Strangely enough, which tells you a lot about eyewitness testimony, right? Because out of all those people, some discrepancies, there was, a lot of discrepancies between all those people. So what happened next? Well, I hit the wrong thing. So my opinion of what happened. At this point, I got to tell you a quick story in that how this book came to be, in that I had looked for testimony for a long time, and my grandfather and others that had written about it had some testimony, but as I found out, all they had was the grand jury testimony and the testimony of the preliminary trials. So while I was doing research for this, I was trying to find out the disposition of the Supreme Court case, because this is going to be appealed here in a minute. When we get through this, it's going to appeal. I tried to find the disposition of what happened from the Supreme Court. And I got this, so I asked the archives. I said, hey, can you give me this information? And they came back and they said, yeah, we've got 547 pages. And I went, well, that's a lot for a deposition. So come to find out, it was the original trial transcripts. It had never been opened before, and they found them for me, and that broke this wide open for me. Nobody had ever seen those before, since 1900, and it was fantastic because I could see all the different sides of things and all the testimony. It was all there. So fantastic. So thank you again, State Archives, because that really did it. Yeah. So what happens is Pete gives Jimmy a revolver and tells him to go use it if he needs to. Bud and Bob walk away, but Bob stops and he starts talking to Will Bilyeu. Okay, they're starting to walk away, but there's kind of this animated talk. Bud turns, and all of a sudden, Steve fires a shotgun. Okay, and I guess at this point, Steve thought that Bud was going to pull down on him, and vice versa, but Steve fires first. Bud returns the fire, but he misses. Steve doesn't hit anything either, but Bud returns the fire. Then Steve fires again, hitting Frank Tabor in the leg. And again, that's his son-in-law, who he didn't like very well, so he obviously he didn't get a good enough shot though, because he just wounded Tabor in the leg. Tabor kind of ran around behind what we call a corn shock, and you know, corn that's all that's up like a corn shock. So he hid behind that during this whole thing. Bud shoots again, hitting Steve in the right side and Xing in the left, killing Steve. Elizabeth Bilyeu, who's still down there, jumps over the fence and takes a knife, a paring knife she had, and starts hacking away at Bud, okay, around the neck and around the head area. Pete jumps the fence and starts shooting his shotgun wildly at the Meadows group, but he throws that down and he grabs his revolver and he starts shooting, and Bob tries to shoot Pete and he hits him just with a couple of pellets in the arm and leg, but then Bud shoots Pete, hitting him in the head, killing him. And then Jimmy, he's firing wildly, he's young, we don't really know his age because we don't have a birth date on him, but he appears to be around 14, 15 years old. And he starts firing wildly at Bud. Bud shoots Jimmy just above the navel, coming out the back of the spine. He lived long enough for somebody to go down to the creek, get some water, and try and bring it back to him, but he died in his grandfather, John Whitten's arms. Well, there's the battle. Go back real quick. Here's the battlefield. Just show you kind of quickly. You can see all these people lined up over here, and there's John Whitten, there's Pete, and there's Jimmy. Steve had jumped the fence, and Elizabeth, and they were going after the Meadows there. So this is the kind of infamous photo that happened. The Bilyeus laid out on bed. They weren't allowed to strip them down outside because the women might see them. So they made sure they got them out of at that point, and they stripped them down, put bedclothes on them, put them in the bed, and then they took this picture. And you can actually see the shot here, right there, in Jimmy. This is Steve, Jimmy, and Pete. Steve, Pete, and Jimmy. You can see where Pete was hit in the head there, just below the eye. And this is one of the articles, headlines from that unfortunate accident. So they were arrested. Bud, Bob, Jose Bilyeu, Martin Bilyeu, and Frank Tabor all arrested. Tabor was he got off. The grand jury didn't indict him, but they indicted Will Bilyeu anyway because they felt like he was antagonizing and kind of started this whole thing. And again, thank you, because there's the original warrant that I got from the state archives. And these are some of the Meadows. This is Bud here. This is Bob. And this is their older brother, Chris, who they stayed the night with on their way up to give themselves up to the sheriff. Also my relative. So the trials on 1899, Bud goes on trial at Ozarks with Judge Neville presiding. He's convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years. And both sides were angry about that, okay? The Meadows thought he should be acquitted. Obviously, the Bilyeu thought he should be hung. So nobody was really happy with that. They did release him on appeal. And he probably would have been acquitted, except there was a big controversy over whether Pete, who was shot in the head, whether he was shot from the front or the back. And the Bilyeus claimed that he was shot execution style from the back, and the Meadows claimed that he was shot from the front and self-defense instead of execution style. So that made a big difference, but when it came down to it, because of that controversy, nobody could figure out which way it went. They ended up giving him the 10 years and not sentencing to death. But they had more trials to do, okay? They're going to do a trial for Meadows-Bilyeu and for Bob. So the prosecution wanted to make their case stronger. So they decided to exhume Pete and have him do a second post-mortem and see if they could prove that he was shot from the back. This kind of backfired because when Meadows-Bilyeu goes on trial for the murder of Pete Bilyeu, the second post-mortem proved that Pete was shot from the front. So it kind of backfired on the prosecution. However, it did prove what should have been proved. So for that, Hosey was acquitted, and at that point he said he'd never live again down in Christian County. He moves his family to Stone County, and eventually Bud, a year later, they trade their farm to the Terrys. And I don't know if you've heard of those, but this is a man named Bone Terry. He himself was having problems in a feud down in southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and some guys came one night and hung him up in a tree. His mother cut him down. So he thought maybe it was better to get out of the area. Probably for his own health. So he swapped farms. He and his brother swapped farms with Bud and Meadows-Bilyeu. And this is the Christian County courthouse at the time when all this was going on. This also, again, thank you to the state, is the original jury verdict that was in among all that from the foreman that sentenced Bud or John Sanford to the second-degree murder. So post-trials, on December 1899, the trial of Bob was to begin, but he was still sick with typhoid fever, so he couldn't have his trial. They delayed it. The Missouri Supreme Court reverses and remands the case of Bud back to the circuit court because of the evidence now we've got of Pete being shot in the front instead of the back. Bud's lawyer makes a motion to quash or dismiss, and Judge Neville overrules it. At first he said, no, we're not going to. But then the next day, Elizabeth Bilyeu, who was Steve Bilyeu's wife, she was the star witness. She ends up dying. So the next day after that, Judge Neville reverses himself and he quashes and he gets rid of the case. But Jake Bilyeu wasn't happy that he swore out another complaint against Bud. Bud is arrested again. However, the case is thrown out and by the grand jury, and the legal proceedings for this are over, or so we think. And they actually are for this incident here. Bud, Jose, and others make their homes in Stone County, and they're all buried down there. There's a church down there that's in Stone County that Bud was part of building. It's still down. It's one of those what we call giraffes churches, right? The stone looks like kind of like a giraffe, and that's down there, and it's right there by the cemetery where all these folks are buried. So you'd think this would be over, but a few years later, about 17 years later, Frank Tabor meets his maker, and he gets into a fight with some of the Blues over some railroad ties and wood. The Blues are accusing Tabor of stealing railroad ties, and Tabor's accusing him of stealing wood off his land. So they get into a fist fight down by Bull Creek, and it ends up where LINZA shows up and he shoots and kills Frank Tabor. LINZA ends up going to, they all get arrested. LINZA goes to trial, and he's found not guilty based upon self-defense. You would think that would be over. However, there was one last thing. This man, Richardson, he was a juror on the LINZA trial, and he ends up being arrested because of perjury. He said he didn't know the Blues. Comes to find out he's very good friends with them. And he goes to trial. However, he's found not guilty. Later on, he's also arrested for bootlegging back during those days when he was a deputy sheriff. So, was this really over a fence? Okay, that was my question over this whole thing was this shooting and killing of all this stuff over just this fence, which ended up being, in those days, like $6 worth of stuff or something like that. It was just incredibly cheap amount of money. And Pete, and most probably Steve, I believe that they think Bud really did kill Claudie Matthews. And even though he got off of it, they used to call him Baby Killer, and they used to, you know, bully him quite a bit. And I think things finally just came to a point over the fence to where it happened. And I don't think it was necessarily the fence, it was just the tipping point of it. None of these men were saints. I'll tell you that. I'm one of the family, you know, descendants, and they all had some kind of record, whether it be in those days carrying a concealed weapon, or there was a lot of acting up in church, and they got arrested for it because the ball knobbers didn't want people acting up in church. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of those kind of things. So none of them were saints. And just to let you know, this is Bull Creek here. Ozark is up here somewhere. Branson be down here. And this is Bull Creek, the area. Around this area is where the Meadows Cemetery is at. And right up in this area is where the Meadows-Bilyeu Feud took place. My wife and I went there this last fall. We went to the shooting area, and the families that lived there invited us in. I took them one of my books, and they showed us the foundation of Bud's house, and there was even some concrete that had been poured there that had the name Terry in it from when the Terrys moved there. So it was kind of nice to stand in the foundation of the old house that was there during the shooting and everything. Very nice. So lastly, I just bring up, where are they? It's always kind of interesting, what happened to Pete's skull? And we don't know. Some people think he ended up on a doctor's display somewhere or something like that. But as far as we know, it was never reburied. Okay? Pete's body's there, but his head's not. Bud's Winchester, kind of wonder what happened to that. It was a very famous or infamous Winchester that it was involved in quite a few other issues with ball knobbers, and it had quite a history, and it's very documented on who bought it. In fact, Bud Meadows bought it twice, and the second time is when he used it on the Blues. I'd love to find photos of Steve, Pete, and Jimmy alive. A photo of Alexander Meadows, because that's my relative, so I'd love to find a picture of him. Where Claudie Matthews is buried, we don't know. I think it's probably in somewhere around Sparta, but in one of those field headstones somewhere. But you know how that is. If you've got relatives, a lot of those field headstones out there. What happened to Gertrude and Joe Bilyeu? Gertrude was a daughter that we didn't talk about of Steve, and little Joey. I can't find any records of anything, what happened to them. So I looked through everything I could find. You would think they'd probably go to a relative to live or something, but I can't find anything about them. And none of the descendants seem to know anything about them. And who was the young son of Christopher Meadows? And we didn't talk about that, but Chris Meadows, he had a young son, and they said in the papers that when his young son died, that there wasn't enough people to actually mourn or go to the funeral because they were all at the trials. And so it's always made me wonder who Chris Meadows is. And this was, by the way, I told you my grandfather was Chris Meadows. Well, his grandfather was Chris Meadows too. So that's why there's a couple of Chris Meadows here. But yeah, I'd love to know that too. So there's some unanswered questions still. But yeah, that's it. Kind of a lot, I know, to cram into a lot of stuff. I think the book explains the courtroom drama a lot more. There's a lot, some people that have read it that are lawyers have told me that one of the most interesting things they found was the differences in how the law and the courts and everything were back in those days. You know, things like the jury could ask questions. For example, they could ask the people questions, and also there was things in there about some crude ballistics testing that happened back then on a dog. There was one of the lawyers actually wore the clothes Pete Bilyeu in there with the bullet holes and blood still on them. To make his arguments that day, wore those clothes in there. So there's a lot of courtroom drama. I think people getting sick during that time. There's a lot of sickness. So I think, I found one of the things when I went to write the book, I was trying to figure out how do I make courtroom stuff interesting, and it just wrote itself. It really did. There was so much that was in there that was so interesting that I just, I really didn't. It's just pretty, to me it was interesting anyway. Hopefully you'll find it interesting as well. So. And really, that's kind of it.
Question.